Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our research webinar. This webinar is number 17 in the series. The focus of this webinar is on white clover, specifically using white clover to reduce chemical nitrogen and also using white clover to increase animal performance. White clover is something that Teagasc has been working on for over 50 years, and our predecessor before us on Forest Talent has worked on white clover. But I think in the past, the work on white clover would have focused on low stocking rate systems, extensive low nitrogen use, and we incorporated white clover into every sward and virtually none of it survived. And there's very little white clover available in Irish pastures at the moment. But I think all that is changing at the moment. There's a couple of very fundamental changes are happening. In the past, nitrogen was very cheap. It's not anymore. But I suppose more importantly, nitrogen is going to be restricted. It's restricted today and it'll be restricted more into the future. And what has also changed fundamentally in the last decade in particular is that farmers have gotten much better at managing grass and at controlling pasture cover. Because of that, the clover, we believe, has a massive role to play, and in the next decade, clover will become as important in our pastures as ryegrass. So today's webinar is going to deal with, I suppose, the benefits, firstly, of grass clover in dairy systems, and Deirdre Hennessy is going to present on that. After that, we're going to look at the benefits of white clover in sheep systems, and Philip Creighton will present on that. And when Philip and Deirdre have convinced you of the merits of white clover, Mike Egan is going to tell us how to put white clover into our pastures. Okay, so Philip and Deirdre and Mike are new researchers who are working with Teagasc for a number of years now in clover systems and have quite a lot of experience at it. At any stage during the presentation, if you have any questions, just please post them there on the question and answer session. And at the end, so it's at the bottom of your screen, you can see the question and answer logo there, and you can input any questions you have for any of the panelists, and we'll try and deal with all the questions we can at the end. Okay, so the webinar should be, in total, we'll have 3 presentations of about 15 minutes each, and then we have about 15 minutes for questions at the end. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Deirdre Hennessy. Deirdre is based here in Moorepark, and she's been working on grass clover systems here in Moorepark for a number of years now. Okay, Deirdre.
Thank you, Padraig. Okay, so good morning, everybody. So as Padraig said, I've been working in grass white clover for the last number of years here at Moorepark, and I'm going to talk to you today about some of the benefits of including white clover in our dairy swards. Okay, so firstly, white clover is of interest and increasing interest to farmers at the moment, and this is driven both by the positive aspects in terms of animal production and herbage production, which you will hear about during the presentation, but also the role it can play in terms of helping farmers, grassland farmers, not just dairy farmers, to deal with a range of challenges, which the industry is facing currently and into the future. So there are challenges around production and sustainability, particularly environmental sustainability. So we are facing likely reductions in the quantity of fertilizer application that will be permitted going forward, both through the nitrates directive, which is to be renegotiated this year, but also the target set out in the EU farm to fork strategy. So that strategy is targeting a 20% reduction in fertilizer use. We also have water quality concerns in Ireland and elsewhere, of course. And then also we have targets to meet in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And white clover and the use of white clover to reduce fertilizer is one of the targets in the Government of Ireland Climate Action Plan. Okay, so the main benefits for the farmer in terms of white clover are around herbage production, milk production, and nitrogen fixation which can lead to a reduction in nitrogen fertilizer use. And these are what I'm going to discuss during this presentation. So just before we get into discussing those benefits, I just want to show you this graph, which is represents sward clover content. So that's the amount of white clover in the sward above 4 centimeters. So in the part of the sward that the cow is grazing across the year. So I have two lines on the graph here. I have a dark green line, which is representing Clonakilty. And within this line, we have average sward clover content over 4 years at Clonakilty from the farm systems experiment. And the lighter green line is from Moore Park, and this is the average sward clover content over 8 years at Moore Park. So you can see in the spring, the contribution that the clover is making to the sward is relatively low. So, you know, in or around 5% when we turn cows out to grazing in February. But sward clover content increases over the spring and into the summer, and it peaks in late summer, early autumn, so around late August, early September time. And you can see both sites report or have measured very similar sward content, so very similar shape graph across the year. Okay, so moving on to look at herbage production. So, you know, how can white clover contribute in terms of herbage production, or what's its impact on herbage production? So this graph here is showing us the results from a plot grazing experiment. So these were large plots, about 8 meters by 8 meters, grazed by dairy cows approximately 8 to 10 times per year. We ran this experiment for 4 years. Okay, so what we had was two swards. So the first type of sward or grassland we had was grass only. And that's represented by the dark green bar. And then we had a grass white clover sward or grass white clover pasture, represented by the lighter green bar. Okay, and then we had 5 fertilizer application rates, which you can see here on the x-axis, ranging from 0 to 240 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. So I suppose the first thing to take from this, from the results of this experiment, are that once we included white clover in the sward, we saw an increase in herbage production regardless of the nitrogen fertilizer application rate. That level of increase declined as fertilizer application rate increased. So it declined from about 4.2 tons when no fertilizer was applied, up to about 1.2 tons, or down to about 1.2 tons at 240 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. Okay, so this, you know, this looks really good. It's really promising in terms of being able to replace some of the fertilizer with clover. So, okay, how does that translate then, though, into a grazed sward or into a farm, basically? So we're going to look at the results from 2 farm systems experiments. The first is from Clonakilty over a 4-year period. So at Clonakilty, my colleague Brian McCarthy had a study looking at grass only and grass white clover swards, both receiving 250 kilos of nitrogen, both stocked at 2.74 cows per hectare. He had 2 types of grass combined with the clover, the first being a tetraploid on the left and diploid here on the right. That's just a difference in the makeup in the genetic makeup of the perennial ryegrass. Okay, so again, the dark green bars represent the grass only swards, and the light green bars are the grass white clover swards. And you can see here again, over the 4 years, there was an increase of about 1.2 tons of dry matter per hectare. So these are grazed paddocks, and we're seeing an increase in herbage production. Looking at another study that we completed here at Moore Park. So there's 4 years data again in this study. So again, we looked at grass only getting 250 kilos of nitrogen, the dark green bar, and then we had 2 grass white clover treatments. So the first received 250 kilos of nitrogen, the same as the grass only. And the second, we had a 100 kilo reduction in nitrogen input, so 150 kilos of nitrogen. So the first thing to note here is that we got an increase of about 1.2 tons of dry matter per hectare when we included clover in the sward receiving 250 kilos. But the really important thing to take from this slide here is this treatment, which received 100 kilos less of nitrogen, produced about 200, 250 kilos more herbage than the grass-only treatment. So we're producing just around the same amount of herbage, but for 100 kilos less fertilizer. So you can see here that this sward is making use of the nitrogen that's been available through fixation, which I'll cover in a minute. Okay, so just to summarize, in terms of herbage production, we see increased herbage production on white clover swards compared to grass-only swards. And we generally see greater herbage production relative to grass-only at the lower nitrogen fertilizer inputs. Okay, now moving on to milk production. So in our systems, what is white clover going to do in terms of milk production? So we've seen from research at Moorpark and at Clonakilty that incorporating white clover into our grassland swards or our grassland pastures results in an increase of 20 to 50 kilos of milk solids per cow per year. So here I have two graphs showing some results from Moorpark on the top and Clonakilty on the bottom. So the first thing to note here is both of these graphs are representing daily milk solids yield. The yellow line on both graphs represents the grass-only sward, and in both cases receiving 250 kilos of dry matter per hectare. Okay, in both swards we can see that the increase in milk solids is coming from mid-April onwards, and once that increase starts to appear, it's sustained for the rest of the year. It's mostly driven by an increase in milk yield rather than a change in milk composition. If you think back to the graph I showed you of sward clover content over the year, so you know this increase in milk solids coincides with that increase in sward clover content. Okay, and the third benefit of white clover in the sward is around nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixation is the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into a plant usable form. And this occurs due to a symbiotic relationship between soil rhizobia, which are naturally occurring bacteria in the soil, and the clover. So when the clover is growing, the bacteria infect the root hairs and they form nodules, and they reside in those nodules. The clover plant then supplies that bacteria with energy, which it uses to convert atmospheric nitrogen into the plant usable form. And this nitrogen is then available in the soil, not only for the clover, but also for other species that are growing in the sward or in the pasture, which in our case tends to be perennial ryegrass. Okay, nitrogen fixation then is influenced by a number of factors, and they include sward clover content, nitrogen fertilizer application rate, and also weather conditions. So generally, as temperatures increase, nitrogen fixation increase, and as sunshine or sunlight increases, nitrogen fixation increases. And some moisture is required for nitrogen fixation. Okay, so looking at some results from a 3-year study where we looked at a grass clover sward and we measured the nitrogen fixation in that sward, getting different nitrogen fertilizer application rates. And the key thing to take from this graph is not the absolute figures, but the fact that as nitrogen fertilizer rate increases, nitrogen fixation decreases. Okay, so I mentioned at the start in terms of the benefit that white clover can contribute to a reduction in nitrogen fertilizer use. Okay, so what does that do for nitrogen use efficiency? You know, there's a lot of talk about nitrogen use efficiency at the moment and increasing that. So firstly, we're talking here about farm gate nitrogen use efficiency. So that's the efficiency with which nitrogen is utilized within the farm gate. Okay, so we're looking at nitrogen entering the farm, such as in the forms of fertilizer, concentrate, and livestock, how that's utilized on the farm and efficiently turned into product leaving the farm. So your product leaving the farm is milk and then livestock, so cull cows or calves, for example. Okay, so firstly, where are we nationally in terms of nitrogen use efficiency? So this is data from the National Farm Survey, the most recent data we have. So the national average dairy farm is stocked at 2.1 cows or livestock units per hectare. Cows are receiving about 1.1 tons of concentrate and about 177 kilos of fertilizer has been applied. Herbage production is about 10.5 tons of dry matter per hectare, and milk solids production is 900 kilos per hectare. And the nitrogen use efficiency on our national average farm is around 24%. If we look at the Moore Park grass-only system receiving 250 kilos of nitrogen over a 4-year period, so this system is stocked at 2.6 cows per hectare. Concentrate fed is around 350 kilos. Nitrogen fertilizer input is higher than the national average. Grass grown is about 13.6 tons, and milk solids produced is per hectare is 1,261. And we see an increase in nitrogen use efficiency here, despite the higher nitrogen fertilizer input and the higher stocking rate. This is driven by herbage production and also the increased milk solids sold from the farm. If we add white clover into the system and we reduce the nitrogen input into that system to 150 kilos, we further increase that nitrogen use efficiency. And that further increase is coming from the reduction in fertilizer application, but also the increase in milk solids production, which is occurring when white clover is included in the sward. Okay, so how does this translate in terms of a farm system? So we have an ongoing farm systems experiment here at Moore Park. We started in 2013. I'm going to show you some results from the 8-year period, 2013 to 2016. So we have 2 farm systems established. The first is grass only, getting 250 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. And the second is grass white clover, getting 150 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. Importantly here, both are stocked at 2.74 cows per hectare. So if you remember earlier, Padraig said a lot of the older research on white clover was at low stocking rates. So our study is looking at a higher stocking rate of whole farm stocking rate at 2.74 cows per hectare. So apart from the fertilizer application, the two farm systems are managed exactly the same. So common rotation length, same target pre-grazing herbage mass, farm cover, post-grazing sward height, and the same concentrate fed per cow in each treatment or in each system. Okay, so I suppose it's important to look at the nitrogen fertilizer application strategy, particularly for anyone who's thinking about implementing a grass white clover system. So how do we go about applying that 150 kilos of nitrogen? So firstly, in the spring, again, think back to that graph that I had earlier. Sward clover content is quite low in the spring period. In our pasture-based systems, we have a high demand for grass early in the spring due to our spring calving systems. So we're applying the same quantity of fertilizer to both sward types up until April, okay, to make sure we have that grass for the first rotation and into the second rotation. But it's from May onwards. So from now onwards, basically, we're reducing the fertilizer input. And here is where we're saving or reducing our 100 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. So I suppose it's important to note here that this 100 kilos reduction is a 40% reduction in nitrogen fertilizer application, which is greater than the 20% targeted under the farm to fork strategy. Okay, so, we have these 2 systems, like what does it look like? How are the systems performing? So here we have a comparison of the 8 years of the 2 systems, so from 2013 to 2020. As I said, both are stocked at 2.74 cows per hectare. So herbage production, annual herbage production and silage conserved is similar on both systems.
Sorry, so we're Deirdre, you have 1 minute left, Deirdre.
Thanks, Padraig. We're producing 13.5 tons of dry matter per hectare, feeding slightly more silage in the grass white clover system. Same quantity of concentrate fed on both systems. Our white clover system has 22% average sward white clover content. And all the literature suggests you need at least 20% to see animal and herbage production benefits. Milk yield and milk solids yield per cow are both greater on the grass white clover system. So milk solids yield per cow is 20% greater. Nitrogen use efficiency, as I mentioned already, is greater on the grass white clover system. And, I suppose from the farmer's point of view, profitability is greater by over €100 per hectare on the grass white clover system. Okay, so to summarize, ladies and gentlemen, white clover offers huge potential in our production systems on a number of levels. Firstly, to reduce nitrogen fertilizer input at farm level, and also in terms of increasing farm gate nitrogen use efficiency. We can also see increases in milk production per cow and per hectare, and I suppose from the farmer's point of view, importantly, an increase in farm profitability. But overall, that including white clover in our systems can contribute to increased economic and environmental sustainability and help us meet our targets around reductions in nitrogen fertilizer use, increased nitrogen use efficiency. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Deirdre. Thanks for an excellent presentation. If anybody has any questions for Deirdre, you can post them there on the Q&A, and we'll have Deirdre back in at the end where we can deal with any questions you have. Okay, to move it along, Philip Creighton has been working on sheep systems research for a number of years now up in Athenry, and he has, in the last couple of years, incorporated clover into that systems research work, and he's going to talk about the benefits they've seen with incorporating the white clover into relatively high stocking rate sheep production systems in Athenry. Okay, Philip, over to you.
Thanks very much, Padraig. So, as Padraig said, I'm going to give an overview here of what we're doing in Athenry in terms of incorporating clover into sheep systems. Thankfully, Deirdre has gone through some of the background to clover in terms of its contribution, nitrogen fixation and that. So I'm going to concentrate mainly on where we see it fitting into a sheep system and some of the current research that we have ongoing to test that and some of the key findings to date. So just to put things in context, if we look at the sheep industry at the moment, and we look at some of the key performance indicators, and these will be based on mid-season lowland flocks, we can see that the national average stocking rate is somewhere around 8 ewes per hectare, with a relatively low output in terms of lambs weaned per ewe of about 1.4, which contributes to a relatively low output in terms of carcass output per hectare of about 225 kilos. But it is using a relatively low level of chemical nitrogen to achieve that. But I suppose ultimately, when we have a low output from the farm, our net margins, it is a much lower income sector, as everybody knows, if we compare it to the likes of dairy farming. And our net margin per hectare there is down around 150 euros per hectare. So I suppose what we're about here is trying to develop systems where we can increase the profitability for Irish sheep farmers. And I suppose some work that we've done recently, this was from the PhD of Elizabeth Earle, a Welsh scholar who was working with us here a couple of years ago, where we were looking at a mainly grass-based system. So this doesn't include clover, but just setting the scene in terms of what was achieved when we concentrated on trying to improve our grassland management, improve our stocking rate levels, improve our output from a grass-based diet. We were able to get those levels up to about 12 ewes per hectare of a stocking rate, so higher carrying capacity, a higher output per ewe in terms of a higher weaning rate of 1.75, which led to a much higher output in terms of carcass output of 420, which ultimately resulted in an increase in net margin per hectare to about 630 euros per hectare. And ultimately, that's what we're about, is trying to improve the profitability. So we'll just keep those figures in mind as we move through the presentation. So firstly then, I suppose when we talk about white clover, what contribution could that make to try and achieve this target of improving the profitability within our systems? I suppose the first one is, as Deirdre has outlined already, in terms of white clover contributing to improved animal performance. Can it contribute to, I suppose, improving or at least maintaining the similar levels of harvest production to support this higher level of output? Can it reduce our chemical nitrogen requirements on sheep farms? And I suppose about 20% of our variable costs within sheep systems goes on fertilizer. So any reduction there obviously would be very beneficial from an environmental point of view, but also from an economic point of view. That has huge implications, which ultimately will feed into our financials or our net margins per hectare, as I said. So with that in mind, we commenced the study here in 2018. So we're not as far down the road maybe as Deirdre is, so we mightn't have quite as much information as Deirdre presented there, some excellent information, but we'll give you what we know so far, and this study is still ongoing, so we're entering our final year now this spring in 2021. But the study is looking at evaluating incorporating white clover into sheep graze swards at 2 different fertilizer nitrogen and stocking rate levels on the productivity of pasture-based lamb production. With 2 stocking rates, 11 and 13 ewes per hectare, which is about the equivalent of 2.2 livestock units per hectare and 2.6 livestock units per hectare. And at each stocking rate then, we have 3 pasture treatments. The first one is a grass only, so perennial ryegrass, receiving 145 kilograms of chemical nitrogen per hectare per year. And as we go forward now, that will be coded as GO, grass only, high nitrogen. Then we have a grass plus white clover, which is again at 145 kilograms of chemical nitrogen per hectare, which will be called GC, HN. And then our final treatment is our grass white clover at 90 kilograms, so a low chemical nitrogen treatment, GC, LN. So firstly then, if we look at animal performance, what is the effect of including white clover into these swards at the 2 different stocking rates and at the different levels of nitrogen? So the bars on the left-hand side in purple are for the groups which are stocked at 11 ewes per hectare, so our slightly lower stocking rate, but still high relative to national average figures. And what we can see there is that lamb days slaughter decrease as we move into grass clover swards, with a range there of about 6 to 16 or 6 to 14 days reduction in lamb days to slaughter. The bars on the left-hand side represent the higher stocking rates, and we can see that as we included white clover into the sward, we did reduce days to slaughter for lambs by about 10 days, going from grass only down to grass plus clover at the higher nitrogen input. But we did have an issue when we got to the low nitrogen input treatment at the higher stocking rate, and we'll come to that in a second in terms of that was mainly to do with forage availability, which did impact in our lamb drafting. So in terms of herbage production then, again, purple bars represent the lower stocking rate, blue bars represent the higher stocking rate. And what we can say here really is that within stocking rate, certainly at the lower stocking rate level, we produced very similar levels or slightly higher levels of forage on the grass clover treatments versus grass only. And similarly, when we move to the higher stocking rate, at the higher nitrogen level, we did maintain our level of production. Slightly disappointing, I suppose, that we didn't increase it. But where we did have an issue here was at the high stocking rate, at the low chemical nitrogen input, where we did grow less forage on the farm. I think because it's a higher stocking rate, a higher feed demand, the main issue here is in the autumn in terms of feed availability. And I think we do need to do further work here in terms of the distribution of growth and the allocation of fertilizer over the course of the year to try and address this. But a positive to take from it, I suppose, is that at least at the lower stocking rate, we were able to reduce our chemical nitrogen input on the grass clover swards and produce the same or more herbage relative to the grass only treatment at the high nitrogen. I suppose just in terms of sward clover content, what sort of content what we're seeing in the swards to achieve this, you will see that it is lower than what Deirdre would have outlined. We are working with small leaf clovers only, and Mike will cover a little bit more about this in his presentation in terms of the different types of clovers. We would like to see these figures slightly higher. So obviously at the moment we're working there between 12 and 14% white clover in the swards. We do have, I suppose, a companion research, a component research program going on in conjunction with these systems trials, where Walsh scholar Lisa McGrain is doing a lot of very detailed work looking at different seeding rates, different establishment methods and different management methods to try and increase the level of white clover in our sheep swards. I suppose it is a factor of the way sheep graze, and the likes of medium and large leaf clovers just don't persist under sheep because of their very, very particular grazing habit. So it is something that we're looking at and trying to further develop as well. I suppose in terms of our chemical nitrogen reduction, just to outline, as Deirdre outlined as well, where we're actually spreading and at what timings. And you'll see again that in the early spring period up to the end of April, we're spreading very similar levels of chemical nitrogen in both the high and low nitrogen application treatments. And it's from May onwards really that we reduce the chemical nitrogen on the low treatments. But it still is a 40% lower application rate for similar levels of herbicide production, except for the low nitrogen treatment at the high stocking rate. And that's where we think further work is required in terms of application timings, distribution of growth, and maybe the ability that is there a cut-off in terms of the stocking rate or carrying capacity. But I suppose most importantly, as I outlined at the start, our financial, the net margin income per hectare is very important, and anything we do, yes, we want to reduce our environmental footprint, and we can reduce our days of slaughter, which will reduce our carbon footprint from the system. But we want to do this in a way that we still will be able to make it a viable system for Irish farmers. And I suppose the positive thing for me in terms of looking at those figures in terms of finances, and this is over the first 3 years from 2018 to 2020, is that we were able to increase our net margin per hectare at the lower stocking rate for the low nitrogen treatment. As I said at the start, because fertilizer makes up about 20% of our variable costs, any reduction there is contributing to an increased income, provided that it still can provide the same amount of feed, which it did. There wasn't as much of a difference at the higher stocking rate, and again, part of that reason was that when we went to those higher stocking rates, there was a little bit less herbage being produced, particularly in that low nitrogen treatment, and there was some supplement had to go in there, so we're not getting the same increase in income. So again, that's something that we need to watch over the next year as we collate the final results. But the positive being that at least we're still up around that €600 per hectare net margin per hectare, which is greatly increased relative to our national average figures. So in summary then, incorporating white clover into our sheep grade swards can reduce our lamb days to slaughter, which can reduce our carbon footprint. Grass white clover swards does require less chemical nitrogen compared to grass only swards, particularly at the lower stocking rate. And high levels of output and profitability can be maintained from grass white clover swards with the added advantage of having a lower environmental footprint. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thanks, Philip. Excellent presentation on the role of clover in sheep systems. And again, if you have any questions for Philip, just post them up there in the Q&A, and we'll have Philip back in again at the end. So I said Philip and Deirdre have shown us the benefits of incorporating clover into our systems. And now Mike Egan, who's a researcher here in Moore Park on different aspects of grassland and grass clover, is going to tell us how to put clover into our pastures. Okay, Mike.
Thank you very much, Padraig. Sorry, this is after slowing up. So thank you very much. And as just to lead on from what Deirdre and Philip are talking about, I'm going to talk about the incorporation of white clover into some of these swards and how we can achieve some of the levels of clover required to get the benefits that Deirdre and Philip have both talked about. So I suppose, first of all, what we need to do is how do we promote clover growth? And Philip and Deirdre have talked in detail about, sorry, I think my slides are in the wrong format. Deirdre and Philip have talked about how the clover has given the benefit of to give the benefit of nitrogen and herbage production benefits. But in terms of what we need, so what we need for clover growth and persistence, and number one, what we need is soil fertility. How do we get good clover contents if we don't have the correct soil fertility? So what we need is we need index 3 for P and K for your grassland swards, and also a soil pH of 6.3 or greater, and ideally 6.5. And what this does is will help in terms of the establishment and the persistence of it, and also having the correct soil pH will help with the root nodule formation to benefit from the nitrogen fixation that Deirdre was discussing earlier.
Michael, you need to change your display settings.
Again, sorry, my apologies about this. Is that better?
No.
If you go to display settings at the top, Michael, top left-hand corner. Yeah, that's it now, Michael.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the second thing is light. So light down to the base of the sward. So how can we do that? And good grazing management practices. So not letting pre-grazing covers go above 14 to 1500 kilos of dry matter per hectare, and continuously grazing our swards between to 3.5 to 4 centimeters. And what this does is will allow light down to the base of the swards so that our clover plant can continue to produce long stolons to have root nodules on them to allow us to increase our overall sward clover content in the sward for the benefits in terms of the animal performance and also in terms of increasing the amount of root nodules that we can get to get the benefit from having the nitrogen fixation element. And I suppose the biggest thing is how do we establish these grass clover swards? And there's two main methods that I'm going to cover today. Number one is direct reseeds, and the second point then is oversowing. So in terms of direct reseeds and in terms of direct reseeds for grassland swards or grass clover swards, there's not a huge variation or difference between them. So we still need to prepare fine, firm seed beds. But the biggest thing that we need to keep in mind, particularly with clover seed, because clover seeds are so small, is that we don't bury the clover seed too deep. So particularly depending on the machine that you're using or the method that we're preparing, that clover seed isn't buried too deep, and ideally somewhere around 12 mil. And if it is buried too deep, because the clover seed is so small and the energy reserves are quite small in that, it doesn't have the energy to push up through the soil and actually emerge above the soil surface if it is sown too deep. In terms of seeding rates, and Philip discussed this slightly when they have changed their seeding rates, but what we're looking for in a grass clover sward when we're including clover in the seed mix is somewhere around 2.5 to 3.5 kilos of clover seed per hectare, or about 1 to 1.5 kilos of clover seed per acre. Some of the research, and we did some research trials on clover inclusion rates, and this turned out to be to give us continuously adequate clover content, good clover establishments to get the benefits that Deirdre and Philip were both talking about. And the last point then, particularly in your reseeds, is your weed control and controlling the weeds in these seeds, and I'll cover that in a little bit in the next slides. But again, clover safe sprays and getting the correct timing, and you can see slightly here in the bottom picture there on the right hand side, there are small dots out. The clover plant is at its third leaf, so this is the ideal time that you want to spray the weeds in this to control it, to get an effective weed kill on those swards. In terms of oversowing, a little bit more challenging, and all of the work that we've done to date has shown that it's more successful, easier to establish a successful clover sward via reseeding. It can be done via oversowing, but it is a little bit more challenging, and I'm going to go through some of the methods and how to do that. So in terms of best timing, or when is the best time to actually oversow a sward, in terms of the timings in the year, it's earlier on in the year, kind of April, May, and part of June. We don't want to go too early when it's still quite cold. And because, as Deirdre discussed already, clover needs, particularly around establishment and germination, it needs soil moisture. And if we go too late into the year, into the summer, into July and August, the ground can be quite dry. So the earlier in the year, the better, and it allows us to manage it better afterwards. So we want to do it after a tight grazing or a surplus cut of bale. So we can see here in this image here that the sward has been cleaned very, very evenly. There is no large grass dung pads left behind. And you can still see some of the brown earth between it. So when that seed goes out, you're going to have a better chance of getting good seed soil contact. In terms of methods, we can look at broadcasting or stitching in. Again, similar to reseeding, whatever the method you use, if it's done effectively and correctly, we can get very good results afterwards. In terms of broadcasting, if you're going at a fertilizer spreader, you want to be careful not to do it on a windy day. Do very small areas at a time because the clover seed is quite small. Mix it with a fertilizer product, a P, an 0730 or a lime, or a very low nitrogen product. It's a little easier to spread it and mix it in the field, and don't travel great distances with it because the seed is so small, it'll all fall to the bottom of the spreader. In terms of stitching it in, you can use a machine that, like in this picture here in Einbach, the likes of the Guttlers or the Uni drills or the Atkinson drills or the Tynehara drills. Again, as long as the method is done correctly, the different methods, the variation between them is quite small as long as it's all done correctly. In terms of reducing nitrogen fertilizer, what that does post oversowing is it will reduce the grass growth rate and allow that clover seed a better chance to establish and germinate without having to compete against very high levels of covers in that grass. Again, soil seed contact is key. That's why it's so important to do it on a very clean grazed sward or after surplus coated silage, and making sure that there's very little residual left afterwards. Sometimes it can be a good idea to use a roller if there is a small residual to push that seed down to the soil, or applying watery slurry afterwards can help push that soil seed down to the soil again. In terms of a seeding rate, we are going to a much higher seeding rate in terms of an oversowing compared to a full reseed, because we're going to get lower levels of germination, and it is more challenging to get this clover plant established in an oversowing. So again, we're talking about 5 to 6 kilos per hectare, or about 2 to 2.5 kilos of clover seed per acre. In terms of establishment and what provides the best results, we already know that reseeding can provide the best results, but when we are going oversowing, there are 3 kind of certain criteria that we need to look for. And those are, again, soil fertility, picking your paddocks that are best suited for oversowing, paddocks that have adequate soil fertility. So again, index 3 for P and K and a soil pH of 6.5. Very good perennial ryegrass content. So they were seeded in the last number of years. They're not very dense. There's very low levels of weed grass in them. And the third point then is there's very low overall level of weeds in them. And if we have the criteria of paddocks that meet those three criteria, those are the paddocks that we can start to oversow first. If there are issues then with residual or with soil fertility, they can be corrected in the following year, and again oversow in the following year. And again, likewise, if there's issues with weeds in those paddocks, they can be corrected this year and oversown again next year. The one issue we need to keep in mind, particularly if we're going to sort in weeds before we start oversowing white clover into these paddocks, a lot of non-clover safe white clover sprays, non-clover safe sprays, herbicide sprays, have a residual effect. So between 2 and 5 months, that clover seed, that spray residual remain in the soil before we can go back in and actually apply clover seed into that sward. So again, it's best to correct the weed issue this year and oversow those paddocks next year once the soil fertility and the weeds are corrected. In terms of establishing clover on your farm, the first thing to do is put a clear plan in place. So again, select your paddocks that are best suited. Again, Pasture-Based Ireland can help with this. So again, look at your paddocks that are adequate soil fertility on your pasture-based report, good ryegrass content and are producing good levels of grass. Put a clear plan in place in terms of the ryegrass content, the methods that's going to be used, whether it be broadcasting or stitching in or the various machines, and again, post-sowing management as well. What we've done, and we started an on-farm study this year with over 30 farms across the country and a variation of dairy, beef and sheep farms. And we're looking at a targeted multi-year approach. So again, we're selecting the best paddocks that are going to give us the best chance of return. And we're going to do it over a 3-year period. So we're going to a combination of reseeding and oversowing, reseeding approximately 10% per year and oversowing an additional 30% or whatever that paddocks that meet that best criteria up to 30%. Again, similarly in year 2, a further 10% reseeded, oversow a further 30% based on their soil fertility and weed issues being resolved. And then year 3, reseed the remaining 10% and oversow any remaining paddocks and paddocks that have failed or didn't establish adequate levels of clover in them on the first time around. And to bear in mind, this is going to be an ongoing process. So it's not going to be all solved or done correctly in the first time. And to maintain clover in these swards over a number of years, we may have to go back into certain paddocks and top them up or reseed some of those paddocks, again, based on the level of or clover content that we have in them. In terms of post-sowing management, clover post-emergent spray, and there was an issue earlier on this year in the back end of last year with clover sprays. We have clover sprays are now going to be available on the market again this year from the middle of May for 120 days. The department are going to has been announced last week. So again, we can avoid clover safe sprays. So any reseeding that is going to be done this year should include white clover in the seed mix because of the availability of these clover safe post-emergent sprays again. And these management rules are going to be the exact same, whether it be a full reseed or an oversowing. But regardless of the method that we've gone with, light to the base of the sward is key. Again, it's going to help with taproot formation, nodules, and stolon formation. So the first grazing should be after reseeding or oversowing should be at a cover of less than 1,000 to encourage the clover plant to increase producing and allow light down to the base of the sward. And the following 3 grazings then at less than 1,200 afterwards, again allowing light down to the base of the sward and not letting heavy covers build up. We should avoid shading for the first 12 months, and again avoiding heavy cuts of silage on these paddocks, and also when you're closing in the final rotation, close them later on so they don't have a heavy cover over the winter and into the following spring. And just to understand why we need to do this, so the white clover plant goes through 3 distinct phases of development. So the rosette phase and the expansion phase are both surviving on a central taproot, and about 12 months after the plant is established, this central taproot begins to die, and the plant then becomes reliant on stolons of the clonal phase. So this is just kind of a graph of what happens with that taproot. So again, the clover plant is fully reliant on the taproot for up to 12 months. After 12 months, then that taproot is gone, and at 2 years, that taproot is fully dead, and the plant is fully reliant then on what's called a stolon. And this is the stolon or the clonal phase of that. So we can, the taproot dies, we now have individual plants that are reliant on stolon formation, and what encourages stolon formation is tight grazing, light down to the base sward, and good soil fertility on those paddocks. And again, grazing management is key in terms of maintaining this, because if we don't have the stolon, we're not going to get any of the above ground benefits in terms of animal performance or the below ground benefits in terms of the nitrogen fixation on those swards. So in conclusion, Padraig, getting the basics right. So again, back to your soil fertility. Pick the crest paddocks that are going to give you the best return on your oversowing. Maintaining clover in the sward, we need key soil fertility, so your index 3 for P's and K's, and also good grazing management. We haven't changed the grazing management guidelines for clover or for your grass only swards. It's still the same, an 18 to 21 day rotation in the summer, pre-grazing covers of between 14 and 1500, and again, grazing those swards down to 4 centimeters to allow light down to the base of the swards. Put a plan in place, put a clear plan in place for your reseeding and your oversowing, and getting the benefits of those paddocks and getting them established well, particularly in the first year. And the post-sowing management, whether it's on a reseed or an oversowing, is vital. Again, particularly in the first 12 months, because it does take a 12-month period for that clover plant to establish. And I've just put in the link here at the bottom of this ward. Earlier on this week on Monday, Teagasc released a clover booklet manual, and if you follow this link, it'll bring you to the website where that is available. So thank you very much, Padraig, and that is me finished. Thanks,
Mike. An excellent, passionate presentation as always from Mike. It's obvious he has lots of hands-on experience of incorporating clover into pastures. So if you have any questions for Mike, you can post them there on the Q&A session. So we'll bring back in Deirdre and Philip now, and we'll work through. There's a lot of questions after being posted, initially for Deirdre and for Philip. So we'll work through some of those questions. So the first few are going back to you, Deirdre. The first one there from Paul Newell Price said you had quite high soil nitrogen supply in Moore Park on that experiment. If you had a lower soil nitrogen, would you expect to get a better response to clover?
Yeah, so that was a high soil nitrogen site, also a good soil fertility site. So, you know, everything I suppose was in the favour of the sward in terms of growth, wasn't limited by nutrients. We possibly would get a higher response to the clover, Paul, particularly once the clover had established. So probably years 2, 3, 4, I would expect a greater response to the clover.
Yeah, a question that's come up quite a few times there, I think, is the nitrogen levels that you were using with clover. Is it economical to apply those nitrogen levels? Because you're not getting as big a response to them as you would normally get. And particularly from May onwards, is there any benefit to applying nitrogen to grass clover swards? Yeah,
so that study where we had the high response to including clover in the sward, if you can think back to the slide, you know, even at the high nitrogen input levels, we had similar herbage production on the grass clover swards right throughout the study. So they were similar at the low and the high nitrogen input when we clover in the sward. So in those cases, there's probably, you know, the economic returns in terms of applying fertilizer are going to be low. And it certainly wouldn't be economical to apply the high levels of nitrogen. And yet in that study, at the low nitrogen rates, we did apply fertilizer only up until about June, and we didn't apply any later in the year. So that's in that system, Padraig, at low nitrogen inputs.
Okay. Deirdre, a question that's come up a few times as well is, the clover in the sward, did it persist over the 8 years, or did you have to oversow it and reseed it, and particularly at the high nitrogen?
Yeah, so we've had excellent persistence of the clover. We sowed those swards in June 2012 and June 2013. We oversowed and reseeded nothing until 2019 we've oversown absolutely no sward, and we have reseeded about 25% of the area, but the other 75% of the swards are persisting either since June 2012 or July 2013. So,
okay.
And they're still average sward clover content across the year is still over 20%. So I'm putting down that persistence to the good grazing management that we're applying. So not basically allowing covers to build up too high during the mid-season and grazing down to 4 centimetres.
Okay, Deirdre or Philip or Mike can take this one. It's from a former colleague, Tim Gleeson. He asks, this work was done in North Cork or Galway, but there's a lot of heavier wet soils up in Cavan, Leitrim, North Roscommon that are prone to heavy frosts. Do you think you'd have the same effect? And Tim specifically says that Ballyhaise wouldn't be representative of those soils. So you wanted to have a go at that, Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Padraig, and thanks, Tim. Yeah, so look, it's going to be a lot more challenging to establish clover on these swards and maintain it in them as well. As part of this new study, we are looking at some farms, and we have a number of farms in the west and in Cavan and Monaghan as well, and Donegal, and we'll be able to get a better handle on that. But it is possible. I wouldn't say Ballyhaise is not representative. There was clover going into Ballyhaise last year and this year. James Humphreys maintained clover content in Sowing as well for a number of years in a high rainfall area. It is going to be more challenging, particularly in every heavy rainfall area in the spring and in the autumn, to avoid damaging that clover plant, and that can be the big difference, particularly in ground that can be prone to pugging and poaching. And also ground that's prone to flooding, it is going to be a lot more challenging to maintain it because of the shallow root structure, and the clover won't persist in those waterlogged soils either. So again, we are building our database of knowledge on this. There is some data there to suggest that it can be possible. It is more challenging. And again, with this on-farm study with those farms included in Cavan, Monaghan, Longford and kind of Donegal, we will get more data on that.
Okay, thanks, Mike. A question for you, Philip. You found positive effects to clover at very low clover contents. Do you think that sheep are different to dairy cows, that they require less clover in the sward to get the benefit?
Yeah, I think there's definitely something going on there, Padraig. I suppose the first thing I'll say is that we were kind of always going to end up with a lower clover content anyway, because we're only using small leaf clover. So when you look at the potential of those relative to medium and large leaf clovers, the clover content is going to be lower anyway. But yes, the levels that we're seeing are lower than your 20% threshold or whatever that you'd expect to need to get the advantages. So yeah, I think some of it is probably just the density of the sward, and the fact that the clover is obviously being able to fix enough nitrogen to give us that boost in terms of overall herbage production. And because the clover is mainly coming in that kind of period just around weaning, and for the first month or two after weaning, it's at its kind of peak production, we're getting the advantages then in the lambs as well. So, but it's a question we have, and it's why we're doing so much component work on trying to manipulate how we manage the swards and establish the swards to increase that content.
Okay, thanks, Philip. Okay, a question there from Deirdre Hennessy. He's asking, is there research on beef farms specifically for clover, and what clover varieties are best? I suppose I worked on clover and beef farms myself 25 years ago, and I know there was a lot of old work done on clover for beef, but there's also a couple of new projects that have started Eddie Reardon and Paul Crossan are leading a new project on clover and incorporating other species into grass swards for beef cattle. And Nicky Byrne on the calf to beef system is incorporating clover. But Mike, you have a lot of commercial farms that you are incorporating clover into now. Is any of those are beef farms?
Yeah, so we have a total of 35 farms, and I think out of 35, 12 or 15 are beef and sheep. 12 farms are going to be beef and or sheep farms.
And
so
are the clover varieties the same on the beef farms as what you put in a dairy farm?
Yeah, so in terms of clover cultivars, and I did mention in the presentation, so in terms of clover cultivars, when we look at beef and cat and dairy grazing systems, we're advocating medium leaf clover. So if you look at the recommended list, it's broken down into 3 categories: large, medium, and small. For dairy and beef cattle grazing systems, we're recommending medium leaf cultivars, so the likes of your Buddy, your Chieftain, Iona, Aberhurld, and Crusader. And then on your sheep grazing systems, because as Phil said already, they're kind of more intensive grazers, they graze lower into the base of the sward, small leaf cultivars, so again, the likes of your Aber-Ace, your Dublin, and your Coolfin. So again, but just to answer the question, the benefits of clover in the sward, if we can get adequate level of clover in a beef system, will be similar to a dairy system as well, if we can maintain that level of sward, because it's going to drive higher level of animal intake, which will in turn increase animal performance, whether it be live weight gain or milk production. But again, it's getting the level of clover in the sward that's required. So again, medium leaf cultivars for your large animal grazing systems and small leaf cultivars for your sheep grazing systems.
Okay, so there's a question there with regard to soil nitrogen. Deirdre, if the clover is growing at its best during the summer, is it going to release a lot of nitrogen into the soils during the autumn, winter, when it potentially can be leached? And could it be worse than artificial fertilizer?
Okay, yeah, so that's a good question. So yes is the answer. Clover will release nitrogen in the autumn. So similar to grass-only type swards, we do see an increase in leaching from soils in the autumn and into the winter period, particularly as rainfall increases. We have done some measurements in Moore Park looking at leaching. So Moore Park would be very free draining soil. And there has been other work done internationally. So from that work, we haven't seen an increase in nitrate leaching from the grass clover swards relative to the grass-only swards getting the high nitrogen input.
Okay. Another one for you, Mike. Can you incorporate clover into old permanent pasture?
You can try. It's a lot more difficult. So what I was going through there with the 3 criteria, so you can still have very good soil fertility, but the big issue is if you have old permanent pastures, they're generally a lot more dense. And once they're grazed, it's very, very difficult to see the soil. So when that seed goes out, it needs soil-seed contact. So if you have a old permanent pasture that is still quite open, and once it's grazed, you can still see the soil, it can be done. But if you have a very, very dense sward, that when that seed goes down, it's not going to get soil-seed contact. And even if it does, when it's germinating, the grass sward, if it's very dense, is actually going to grow over it and not let light down to the base of the sward, which that clover plant needs. So it can be done. It's very difficult. Some of the original pilot work we did on commercial farms in 2015 and 2016, we had 10 farms across the country. And the 2 biggest criteria of paddocks that failed when we oversaw them was soil fertility and soil condition. And what I mean by that is the level of density in that sward. So again, the more dense these paddocks are, a lot more difficult it is to establish clover versus via oversowing. So in that case, it may be best sometimes to do a full reseed if it has that high level of density. But again, it can be done if they're not very dense.
All right, could I just come in there for 1 second? Just as regards the sheep swards, and like what Mike was saying there, just a quick thing. The old permanent swards are very thick, but even sheep swards that are relatively young with good levels of perennial ryegrass can be quite dense. And our experience will be that you have to use some sort of a stitching operation, not broadcasting, because you need to rip some level of that grass open because it's gone so dense from the sheep grazing to get a successful establishment. Just as a comment.
Okay, Philip, while I have you there, I have a couple of questions for you. Did you include in your economics, did you include the cost of incorporating the clover, of reseeding and incorporating the clover into the pastures?
Yes.
Or the cost of overseeding?
Yes, so within that we do include any costs going into each of those systems. So it's full farmland system study. So any costs going into each of them is included. So yes, there is a cost to establishing the Clover, but as we can see from the results so far, there is a very positive financial return in what it's doing for us in terms of reducing overall costs.
Okay, and this is probably something to comment on. Someone said the sheep are probably selectively eating the clover out of the sward and are probably eating a higher clover content than what you're actually measuring in the sward. Would you agree?
I would agree, and I suppose the fact that it is all small leaf, again, it can be quite hard sometimes to get the entire sample in terms of, because it's small leaf and really clinging to the ground at times. That's exactly what's happening. The sheep are very selective in what they're selecting, and we may be slightly underestimating the amount of clover we have, but consistently with the best methods that we have, that's the results we're getting so far.
Okay, Deirdre, a quick one there from Mike Reed. Did you get elevated milk urea or non-protein nitrogen in your milk when you had high clover in the swards in the autumn?
Yeah, so firstly, we didn't see a change in overall milk protein content with the clover in the sward. The reason being that our swards generally have adequate crude protein for milk production, so there's no increased benefit of any extra protein in the sward. We didn't see huge increases in herbage protein content either, small increases. There possibly is some potential for increase in milk urea, Mike. We have looked at it and we haven't seen hugely significant differences. And I can send you a paper afterwards where we have some of that information. It doesn't seem to be a big problem.
Okay, thanks, Deirdre. I'm running out of time now, so I'm going to take one or two more. For Mike, can you comment on, I suppose, clover seed dressing and inoculation? Is it of benefit?
So in terms of seed dressing, there is seed dressing or coated seed sold in Ireland. Inoculated seed is not as common, and there isn't a huge amount of work done on that in Ireland. There has been work done internationally on it, and it has shown benefit. In terms of getting that inoculation, it needs to be from the area that it is going to be going into. That's the one key thing with inoculating the seed. In terms of the seed dressing, there is a benefit in terms of seed dressing, particularly in an area where it's going to be broadcast, because it's going to make that seed heavier and it will travel better if it is seed dressed, because there's going to be a heavier seed, so it's going to be 40% of the coating is going to increase the overall weight on it. In terms of the benefits of both, again, if you have naked seed or coated seed, both can give you very good establishments if done correctly. If not done correctly, neither are going to give you very good establishments on those swards. So again, it's down to the management afterwards again. And one thing to bear in mind, just quickly, Padraig, on the coated seed is if you have a kilo of coated seed and a kilo of naked seed, 40% of that coating of the kilo is coating. So you have 40% less seed in a kilo of coated seed versus naked seed. Okay,
I'm going to take one last question. And Deirdre or Michael, you can answer this. It's from Michael Murphy. Is there a role for minor nutrients? He suggested boron or sulfur. Is there any other nutrients you think that there's a requirement for to help the clover?
Yeah.
Okay, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to say there is, and actually in this the booklet, I'm doing a little plug for it now, but in the booklet there's actually a full section on that, on all the minor nutrients and the levels that they play on it. So there is a role for them. I'm not going to go through them all in detail now, but there is a role, and we have them. Deirdre actually put a lot of work into it, but it's kind of a star rating system in that booklet on the different micronutrients for it. Okay, thanks for that, Michael. Listen, firstly, apologies to everyone that I didn't get to all the questions. They were just kept coming in there at an awful rate there for the last 5 minutes. But I suppose time has come against us. On your behalf, I want to thank Philip and Deirdre and Michael for excellent presentations on clover, which I think is going to become a real topical thing for us over the next decade and a big focus of the new GRAS 10 program. Also, I suppose just make you aware that in 2 weeks' time, we have our next webinar on the role of grass breeding and evaluation to increase the sustainability of pasture-based systems. That's here again 2 weeks from now on the 12th of May at 9:30 to 10:30. Thank you all for logging in this morning and for your questions and your participation. Okay, thanks everybody. We'll shut it down now.